in terms of the Australian Economics Olympiad, that there are 40 multiple choice questions that for your own exams, there may be 10 or 20, but here there are 40. So that these are a lot of marks that are on offer. So what I wanted to do was to offer a bit of a short presentation on how to maximize your ability to get these multiple choice marks. And that if we think about how the exam itself breaks down, and we'll be providing more information on this as we lead up to it, that there's 40 multis, 3 open-ended, and a bonus question. So you can see that the kind of importance that multi-choice plays in this particular exam part of the AEO. So that if we know that multis count for a lot, I think that it's important to have strategies for this, to not just kind of run into it and be like, all right, multiple choice, that's the easy section. I'm going to go through as fast as possible, and I'm going to get to the extended response. I think that it's really important to have a plan of attack, a game strategy to deal with multiple choice sections, indeed all of the sections, but especially this where students might be tempted to see it as much easier or rush through it and maybe not get the maximum amount of marks that they're capable of. So I've got 3 steps for it. And then the first step here is to ignore your answers. And what I mean by that is when you're in the exam is essentially you like put up a piece of paper over the answer categories. So all you've got is the question. I'll show you an example. I'm using for these questions from the last year's New South Wales HSC exam. So when you take away the answer categories, what it's really forcing you to do is to think about what content do I need to focus on? You've got lots of big syllabi to think about, but where should you be focusing your interest? And then before you've even got the answer categories is to think about what are some likely responses to this question? What are some ways that I could potentially address it? And so what I'm thinking about, say we've got this question here. Question reads, this is from last year's New South Wales Economics HSC. A jobless person has now stopped looking for work due to a lack of suitable job vacancies. Which row of the table? Okay, we don't have the row of the table, and that's fine. All we're going to do is just focus on this pit here. If I've got a jobless person who has stopped looking for work, I'm starting to think about, okay, we're looking at someone who is unemployed in some way because they're no longer looking for work. This is because of the lack of suitable job vacancies. And I'm also thinking about, okay, so they're unemployed, but there's something in this language of now stopped looking for work, right? And we're going back, we're thinking, oh, I know the definition of unemployed is that they're not employed, but they're actively seeking work. Here, they're not actively seeking work. So I'm starting to think about the issues of unemployed, labor force, that kind of thing, even before I get into the answer categories themselves. So then you can see when I get the actual categories here, right, I'm starting to think about, okay, now I know that because they're no longer seeking work, they're not considered unemployed. And also, they're not going to be counted in the labor force because, well, they're not part of those groups that are actively seeking work. So I think here that they're trying to potentially trick you in sort of saying that this jobless person, you're thinking, okay, well, they're going to be considered unemployed, that kind of thing. But because we have actually gone and we've thought about it in terms of before the answer categories, we're getting our mind into the right position or the right state to be able to then go ahead and deal with it. I think that that can be really helpful. If we go to another one here from the same exam, why might a government look to end a short-term wage subsidy, right? So here I'm thinking about, even before I've looked at the answer categories, I'm thinking about, okay, if the government wants to end a subsidy, I can think about things like, well, a subsidy is costing the government money. So if it's going to end the subsidy, maybe that's going to improve the budget outcome, reduce the deficit, increase the surplus, that kind of thing. Maybe it's trying to end the subsidy in terms of improving its fiscal position. And so that can be a way to get our mind ready and then be able to answer the question quite effectively. Our second step in terms of becoming better at multiple choice questions or having a game plan is to shrink our options. And so what I mean by that is, say, for example, if you've got 4 options going from 1 in 4 to 1 in 2. In the AEO, where there has been 5 answers in the past, going from 5 to maybe 2 or 3 to improve your odds of being able to answer that question. So what I'm thinking about here, we can see this question here also from the HSC, and that what it's saying here is that which row of the table shows the combination of shifts in AD and AS that is most likely to lower GDP, right? So we're thinking, okay, we've got a lot of things going on here. I just want to make my life a bit more simple here. So what I'm thinking about is that if we want to lower gross domestic product, what I might do is just say, let's just focus on aggregate demand to start with. Now, if you haven't done aggregate demand yet, that's okay. Aggregate demand is the sort of the sum total demand of total demand in an economy. So if I'm thinking about what shift in demand would reduce GDP or the amount of output produced in an economy, I would want it to shift to the left. That would reduce the amount of GDP. So what I then do is if I say AD has to shift left, I can get rid of A and B, and I've turned this into a 50-50 question. So rather than jumping into the question and being like, what's the right answer? What I'm trying to do is to eliminate the least likely first, and then be able to get into the detailed process of answering the question. You might also say in hearing these tips, you're like, this is adding time to multiple choice. This is actually going to reduce my time to do shorts and essays. And initially that's true, but you will get better at this process, more strategic at this process, and eliminate some of those silly mistakes that come up that can cost you marks. So here, I'm trying to shrink the pool of answers. I'm improving my odds to answer this question correctly. So if I'm thinking about the second half of this, I've got left, left, and I'm thinking, well, I'd want both to decrease so that here it would be left and also left, that would be what would likely to lower gross domestic product. Okay. If I look at this question, this is still in my second tip of improving your odds. The question reads, which of the following is most likely to result from a depreciation in a nation's currency? So I'm thinking here, okay, so I want to get the answers where currency becomes weaker relative to other currencies. So if I just look at A and B, if I blocked out the answers, for example, that's not a very effective way on Zoom of blocking out the answers. But if I got rid of the answers and I just looked at it, if a nation's currency depreciates, imports are going to become more expensive. So I can already get rid of A here. Imports are not going to become cheaper. Likewise, I can think if the currency becomes lower, then its exports become cheaper. So now I'm only dealing with B and C, right? And I'm not sort of focusing on which one's right at this point, but I'm able to get rid of A and D, and then I'm ready to go between these two. So what I say to students, what I've said to students in the past, is that if you can just get it to a 50-50, or at least better than 1 in 4, then you are on the right track and you will be able to improve your multiple choice performance. I might just pause there to see if there's any questions or things before I continue on with some of the next steps here. No problems. You can just put them in the chat or just jump in. Step 3 is a suggestion that I make to all students in terms of being able to really eliminate some of the confusion and things that can happen with exams. Because I know from my own situation or from my own track record in sitting exams that I make mistakes in exams that I would definitely not make in other circumstances. There's something about the pressure of it and the intensity of it and sitting quietly in this room and the clock ticking and the time being listed on the board that makes it a more high pressure situation than answering the questions in other contexts. So if I think about what I mean by annotate as you go, let's say that I've got this question here, also from last year's New South Wales HSC exam, but this is content that would be covered anywhere across the country in economics. So it says here, the diagram shows a shift in AD for an economy. Okay, and you're thinking about, all right, well, there's an arrow pointing there. And then it's got this very, what I think is quite tricky wording. Aside from all other things being equal, it says, which of the following factors is not likely to have caused this shift? So, and then you've got those 4 things there. All of this is making my head hurt in a way in terms of thinking about what should I actually be thinking about. So rather than kind of sinking into this confusion, what I would do is I would take my pen and I would physically annotate the question. So I've just typed it here because it's easier. And the kind of things that I would be focusing on is to tell myself, because these are really messages for myself, is to tell myself, firstly, focus on aggregate demand. That is what the question is asking about. That is where your attention should be focused on. What is the shift in aggregate demand? Okay, so remember total demand, aggregate demand, it's going to shift left. So what we're seeing is a decrease in aggregate demand. Still not getting into the answer categories. What I'm trying to do is get this really clear in my head in terms of what this question is asking. The next thing I would circle or highlight is the fact that it says, which of the following factors is not likely to have caused this shift? It's not an effect question, it's a cause question. And to further complicate it, it's what has not caused this shift. Again, very confusing, but what I'm trying to do is to list these annotations down so that I can get clearer in my mind. The question is asking us which did not cause aggregate demand to decrease. I would, in some circumstances, actually write down in sort of plain English what the question is asking. So it's asking us which did not lead to a fall in aggregate demand. And then we can start to get into all of these things here, and that you can think about it in terms of these terms. What I want is I want something that moves things the other way. Because it's saying which of the following factors did not result in a fall in aggregate demand. Very confusing, particularly, this is only question 8 out of 20 in the HSC. So it's not sort of ranked as a hard question, but I think the way that it's set up can be confusing. So I'm looking for something that would push aggregate demand the other way, and an increase in exports would look like a pretty good candidate for that. So tricky. So if I just, before I move on to the next part, if I just go back a bit, I think about my steps, I think about ignore your answers, ignore the list of answers that you have, just focus on the question. If I then think about shrinking my options, improve your odds in terms of your ability to answer this question. And then the third one that we just went through is to annotate as you go. This is the one that you are likely to resist the most as a suggestion because you just want to get the multiple choice answered. I think that as you improve, the annotations will decrease that you will need. This is really helpful at earlier points. Then what we've got is we've got a bonus question. This is something that I have come to more recently as something that I strongly support. And this is to change your answers, to change your multiple choice answers. When I was younger, my teachers would almost always say that your first answer is most likely the most correct, right? And that you should be very, very hesitant about changing your answer, right? And so when I'm thinking about this point, what I'm saying is that there is another view, which is very much about it is okay to change your answers, and sometimes it is desirable. What I'm basing this on is there is a very popular and I think very brilliant organizational psychologist named Adam Grant, who wrote this book called Think Again, which is all about rethinking, to question your sort of assumptions and to really look at changing your mind in certain circumstances. And so in his research, he looked at things where a group of psychologists reviewed 33 studies and found that in every one, the majority of answer revisions were from wrong to right. He also talks about how psychologists counted eraser marks on the exam of more than 1,500 students in Illinois. Only a quarter of the changes were from right to wrong, while half of the changes were from wrong to right. So I'm not saying that this is always going to be the right way, but you should really think about when you're going back and reviewing your answers that there is advantage, benefit sometimes to being like, you know what, no, the correct answer is here. And some of the research backs up this idea in terms of that as well. So for something more, something else as well, and I'm happy to provide these slides and these links, there was an article on The Conversation that was looking at students' responses, and that again, that the revisions, the changes from the first instinct to a new choice resulted in a correct answer. So all I'm saying with multis, your first answer is not always your best answer. That definitely go back, have a look at it, review it. And if you feel like there's a better answer, then there's science here to back up the idea that that might be the right call. Definitely don't go through multi second guessing yourself as you go. Only do this process when you review it.